Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains space! And today, we are discussing space vehicles, but only really bad ones, because this is a horrible place where we talk about terrible design decisions and bad management of those said bad design decisions. These are 5 of the worst space vehicles ever. The Vanguard TV-3. Now, I want to preface this whole thing, actually, with the fact that when you're talking about poor space vehicles, it's not that much of a long list, only because, generally speaking, either it doesn't work or it does. And even if it doesn't work, sometimes they go back to the drawing board and redesign it, but still leave it with the same name. So, it was hard to find a lot of really good examples of really bad designs for space vehicles. Plus, in the grand scheme of things, compared to pretty much every other vehicle type, there just aren't that many spacefaring vehicles these days. Because, well, it's still kind of uncharted territory. There's a lot of progress to be made when it comes to spaceflight in general. And we are so not even close to the infancy of space travel, I would argue. Like, we still haven't even been born when it comes to interstellar flight. I mean, come on now. There's a lot we could do. Why aren't we in space yet? Why aren't we on the moon again? What are you doing? But let's talk about the TV-3, which is short for Test Vehicle-Three. It was the first attempt of the United States to launch a satellite into orbit. See, the Soviets had launched Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2 by this time, so we were actually really behind the curve in terms of spaceflight, but we couldn't let those filthy communists beat us in space. We had to catch up with them, but there was a lot of work to do. Now, this was a satellite launch, so it was unmanned, which is good because things did not go well pretty much instantly. It was supposed to utilize the Vanguard 3-stage rocket system to achieve orbit and study the effects of the environment on a satellite and its systems while in that orbit. There were certain effects that space would have on Earth-based materials that we just didn't fully understand at that time. The TV-3 was supposed to help us better understand it and prepare to eventually launch a person into space. It was also supposed to get geodetic measurements through orbit analysis as well, and it had solar cells on board for power, which were manufactured by Bell Laboratories. The launch was attempted on the 6th of December 1957 at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. At first, it all seemed fine. The booster ignited and it began to rise off the ground. 2 seconds later, now seriously, 2 seconds later, the rocket lost thrust and fell back to the launch pad. The fuel tanks ruptured as it landed, and it exploded, which destroyed the rocket and severely damaged the launch pad. Interestingly, the Vanguard 1A satellite actually was thrown clear of the blast and landed on the ground a short distance away, with its transmitter still sending out a beacon signal. It was slightly damaged and couldn't be reused, but they saved it, and it's now on display at the National Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian Institution. The cause of this particular accident wasn't actually ever really determined. They really weren't sure exactly what went wrong, though the leading theory was that it had something to do with the fuel system, possibly low fuel tank pressure during the starting procedure. General Electric, though, argued that the problem was a loose fuel connection rather than a pressure issue. Either way, though, everyone seemed to be in agreement that it was something to do with the fuel, which does make sense given it did lose thrust, and that generally would mean some kind of fuel issue. The failure was actually an international relations nightmare. Not only did domestic newspapers make fun of the government for their failure to get something into space as the Russians had, but the Russians seized the opportunity to throw some Soviet shade right in the United States' faces. A few days after the incident, the Soviet delegate to the United Nations inquired whether the United States was interested in receiving aid earmarked for undeveloped countries. Oh, that stings. The N-1 rocket. You know, Soviet Union, you guys shouldn't throw shade when you know that you've had plenty of mistakes all on your own. Though admittedly this debacle did happen after the failure of the TV-3, but still, the N-1/L-3 actually was a super heavy lift launch vehicle intended to deliver payloads beyond low Earth orbit. It was, in effect, the Soviet counterpart to the United States' Saturn V. It was meant to carry a crew to the moon and beyond. Studies into it began as early as 1959, and true to Soviet form, it was very much a go big or go home mentality. Its first stage, known as Block A, remains the most powerful rocket stage ever flown, which is nice and all, but it was also the only stage that ever worked. Because of competition from the Americans, who were rapidly catching up in the space race, the Soviets really pushed hard to get the N-1 finished, so naturally, it was rushed, and it was viewed as underfunded as well. There was a significant lack of static test firings, so a lot of issues with the plumbing, as well as other adverse characteristics with the overall design, which incorporated a large cluster of 30 engines, weren't revealed until way later in development, like when they actually tried to launch it. And then it didn't work. Official development didn't actually start until October of 1965, which was almost 4 years after the Saturn V. And it wasn't just the lack of funding or the rushed mentality. The chief designer on the project, Sergei Korolev, actually died in 1966, and that badly hindered progress. They only attempted to launch the thing 4 times, and every single one of the launches failed. Eventually, Soviet higher-ups had enough, realizing they were wasting money to do something that, well, the Americans had already done anyway. It was money and technology that could be better spent in other avenues. So the N-1 program was suspended in 1974, and then officially canceled in 1976. A lot of those elements that I'm telling you were actually kept secret for a very long time until 1989. Oh yeah, it's worth mentioning, the second flight, the 3rd of July, 1969, yeah, that failure caused it to crash back into the launch pad, which resulted in one of the largest accidental artificial non-nuclear explosions in history. So yeah, it didn't go well.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The Salyut 1, sometimes called DOS-1, was actually the world's first space station, which was launched into low Earth orbit by the Soviet Union on April 19th, 1971. Now, putting the Salyut 1 on here might seem like a bit of a low blow, since this is a crowning achievement. It is the world's first space station. It was a significant step forward in terms of spaceflight, but the way the Soviets went about it was not great. For one thing, it was tiny, like unspeakably, unrealistically tiny. You could only comfortably fit a crew of 3 on board, because the actual thing was basically just 2 of their Soyuz modules just kind of duct taped together. Only instead of duct tape, they used the hull of an R-7 rocket. Now, to be fair, given the fact this was the first ever space station, again, the effort shouldn't be understated, but it did result in killing several people. See, the Soyuz missions 10 and 11 both tried to hard dock with Salyut 1. 10 had to be aborted because they just couldn't actually do it due to technical malfunctions. Soyuz 11 did, but then all 3 cosmonauts died on re-entry. They're actually the only 3 people to ever have died above the Kármán line, technically in space. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Viktor Patsayev, and Vladislav Volkov. Because of their deaths due to asphyxiation, and the fact they weren't wearing pressure suits, the Soyuz capsules had to be redesigned in order to make sure that the crew could actually wear pressure suits in the event of such another failure. And because of that, Salyut 1 just didn't have any visitors at all. They tried to prolong its inevitable orbital decay by pushing it into a higher orbit, but in the end it was decided to just abandon the thing altogether. Which is unfortunate because it possibly could have been adapted into something that was truly interesting. But due to the hiccups involving overall design management from the Soviets, Not just because of the station, but also the Soyuz capsules, more on them later. The Salyut 1 just never got to do much of anything. The thing had actually run out of fuel, and they didn't have a redesigned Soyuz spacecraft ready yet. So, because nothing could be sent up to actually give it more fuel in order to fix its orbit problems, they had no choice but to destroy it.
Liftoff will start in T-minus 10 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7.
The Apollo 1 Command and Service Module. Oh boy, a lot of space enthusiasts are probably well familiar of this particularly horrific story. And for those that don't, maybe you've always been a little confused as to, hey, why is Apollo 11 the one that landed on the moon first? What about 1 through 10? Well, the Apollo program was meant to be the steps needed to actually putting a man on the moon, but there was a lot of steps between where they were and actually doing that. They had to start small and work their way up to make it as safe as possible, ironing out any and all kinks involving the equipment they were going to use, including the Saturn V rockets as well as the Command and Service Module. The Apollo 1 incident actually did not happen in space or even at launch at all. This happened on the ground, when they were preparing for a launch that was scheduled for February 21st, 1967. But on January 27th, all 3 of the crew members, Captain Pilot Gus Grissom, Senior Pilot Ed White, and Pilot Roger B. Chaffee, were killed, and the command module was entirely destroyed. What happened? You didn't even launch anything, NASA! Well, you have to remember that the Apollo Command and Service Module in and of itself was much bigger and far more complex than any manned spacecraft up until that point. And there were a lot of questionable design decisions that even the crew was starting to notice. For example, there was a large amount of flammable material inside the capsule, such as nylon netting and Velcro. Now, both the astronauts and technicians found that convenient for holding tools and equipment in place, which is great and all, but flammable! The manager for the Apollo program at the time was Joseph F. Shea, and when the crew expressed concern over this problem, he did give his staff orders to tell North American Aviation, the people who were actually building the capsule, to remove the flammable materials. But he didn't supervise that issue personally. North American shipped the spacecraft to Kennedy Space Center on August 26, 1966, under a conditional Certificate of Flight Worthiness. Why was it conditional? Because 113 significant, incomplete planned engineering changes had to be completed at the Space Center. On top of that, another 623 engineering change orders were made and completed after delivery. The changes were so frequent and common that the training simulator engineers couldn't keep up with it, and Grissom was so frustrated over this that he took a lemon from a tree by his house and hung it on the simulator, which is kind of funny, but the point was this was not going well at all or smoothly in any way. The command and service modules were eventually mated in the KSC altitude chamber in September, and combined system testing was finally performed. And it slowly began to come together, to be fair. It was believed to be working as intended. And you have to remember, the guys doing this, the astronauts, were well aware of the risk they were taking. Grissom even said in a February 1963 interview that NASA could not eliminate risk despite precautions, because of course they couldn't. This was completely uncharted territory. There's going to be some level of risk, no matter how careful they are. However, what no one really expected was such a catastrophic failure occurring while still on the ground and without even intending to ignite a rocket. It was just a simulation of the launch, again on January 27, 1967, on Pad 34, and it was a plugs-out test, which was meant to determine whether the spacecraft would operate nominally on internal power while detached from all cables and umbilicals. Basically, it was putting it in a situation where it would be in space, because you couldn't exactly plug it into a wall socket while you're orbiting the Earth. Naturally, it had to pass this test in order to make the February 21st launch date, because if it didn't, well, they couldn't exactly put it into space like that. It wouldn't have any power. That's not good. No, we don't want that. So this test totally makes sense in terms of what they were trying to figure out. It was also considered non-hazardous because neither the launch vehicle nor the spacecraft was loaded with fuel or cryogenics, and all the pyrotechnic systems, like the explosive bolts, were disabled. So really, no one had any reason to expect anything going wrong here. all countdown functions up to the simulated internal power transfer had been successfully completed by 6:20 p.m., and at 6:30, the count remained on hold at T-minus 10 minutes. Because the cabin was fed with pure oxygen, the fire spread way faster than it otherwise would have, and it caused the pressure inside to rise to 29 psi, which ruptured the command module's inner wall. Flames and gases rushed outside the command module through open access panels to 2 levels of the pad's service structure. The ground crews struggled to reach the astronauts due to the intense heat and smoke, plus the fact that they were given gas masks that were designed for toxic fumes, not smoke, which are 2 different things. At the time, the hatch consisted of 3 different parts: a removable inner hatch, which stayed inside the cabin, a hinged outer hatch, which was part of the spacecraft's heat shields, and an outer hatch cover, which was part of the boost protective cover enveloping the entire command module to protect it from aerodynamic heating during launch and from launch escape rocket exhaust in the event of a launch abort. The hatch was designed to keep the astronauts safe inside the capsule, but not safe from the capsule. It took 5 minutes for the pad workers to open all 3 of the hatch layers, and they couldn't drop the inner hatch to the cabin floor as intended, so they just pushed it out of the way to one side. Cabin lights were still on, but they were unable to see the astronauts through the dense smoke. When they finally found them, all 3 men were dead. The resulting investigation was questionable at best. NASA Administrator James E. Webb asked then President Lyndon B. Johnson to allow NASA to handle the investigation internally according to its established procedure, promising to be truthful in assessing blame. The cause of death for all 3 astronauts was determined to be cardiac arrest caused by high concentrations of carbon monoxide. Though all 3 of their bodies suffered 3rd-degree burns, it was determined that this was done post-mortem. They had already died by the time the actual flames got to them. A major cause of the accident were an ignition source that was actually never determined. They really didn't know exactly what caused it, though they believed they had a few ideas, such as vulnerable wiring carrying spacecraft power, or perhaps vulnerable plumbing carrying a combustible and corrosive coolant. They also mentioned the pure oxygen atmosphere at higher than atmospheric pressure also fueled the fire. There was inadequate emergency preparedness during the event. There was still a whole bunch of combustible materials in the cabin, and the hatch. That stupid hatch could not be removed quickly at high pressure at all. The inner hatch cover used a plug door design, which was sealed by high pressure inside the cabin, not outside. The normal pressure level used for launch, 2 psi above ambient, created sufficient force to prevent removing the cover until excess pressure was vented. The emergency procedure at the time called for Grissom to open the cabin vent valve first, allowing White to remove the cover, but Grissom was prevented from doing that because the valve was located to the left, behind the wall of flames. Also, while the system could easily vent the normal pressure, its flow capacity was utterly incapable of handling the rapid increase to 29 psi caused by the fire. North American originally suggested the hatch open outward and use explosive bolts to blow the hatch in case of this kind of emergency, as had been done in Project Mercury actually, but NASA didn't agree with this, arguing the hatch could accidentally open, as it had on Grissom's Liberty Bell 7 flight. So the explosive design was rejected in favor of a mechanically operated one for both the Gemini and Apollo programs. Before the fire, the Apollo astronauts had actually recommended changing the design to an outward opening hatch, and they had actually already slated to include that idea in the Block 2 command module design. That change was based on the ease of exit for spacewalks and at the end of flight, rather than for emergency exit, but it still might have changed how this all played out. The thing was, they just couldn't open the door. Whether inside or outside, it was too difficult. Design changes for the Apollo program modules were implemented almost immediately, in order to prevent this exact thing from ever happening again. In fact, the name Apollo 1 wasn't even official at the time of the accident. NASA made it the official name in honor of the crew, as it had been their idea.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have ignition.
The Suez 7K OK. The Suez 7K OK was most certainly not okay. Nothing about this was okay. Though, admittedly, it did have some successful launches and was an early design of the Suez, and by early I mean the first. It was flown between 1967 and 1971, and it was used for the first ferry flights to the Salyut space station that I already put on this list. Wait, oh no. See, the 7K OK was kind of the reason why the Salyut failed. It wasn't just that the Salyut was slapped together. I mean, it was, but had they actually had a decent docking module, they might have gotten some use out of it. But the 7K OK had a lot of problems, and it's notable for having the only fatalities of the Soyuz program, entirely. Soyuz 11 I already mentioned in 1971, the 3 men that were killed by depressurization during re-entry. But there was another one. The first one. Soyuz 1 had a terrible incident that only killed 1 man, but his death was prolonged and just so horrific that it's going to be very difficult for me to make this entertaining without making you sad today. And I just want to warn you about that now. But I'm here to give you facts, and these are the facts. The 7K OK did wind up having better design elements put into it, but much like the Apollo program only fixed its problems after Apollo 1, Soyuz program only fixed its problems after Soyuz 1. The initial module that was supposed to go into space was apparently so badly designed that the cosmonauts made it a point to say something about this. Basically flat out telling their higher-ups that if someone goes up in this thing, they are going to die. And the one man who was assigned this particular mission by the Soviet Union was Vladimir Kamarov. He was a Soviet test pilot, aerospace engineer, and cosmonaut, and he'd already been on one mission into space. He commanded Voskhod 1 in October of 1964, which was historically relevant as the first spaceflight to carry more than 1 crew member. But he was eventually assigned to be the solo pilot of Suez 1, and this result would make him the first human to die in space flight. The Soyuz 1's engineers are said to have reported 203 design faults to party leaders, but their concerns were overruled by political pressures for a series of space feats to mark the anniversary of Vladimir Lenin's birthday, because that was apparently way more important than anything else. Okay. Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space in general, was actually the backup pilot for Soyuz 1 and was well aware of the design problems and the pressures from the Politburo to proceed with it. He actually attempted to bump Vladimir Kamarov from the flight because Kamarov and Gagarin were very good friends, and he didn't want his friend to, well, die. Kamarov, though, wouldn't give up his spot because that would risk Gagarin's life. He was willing to accept the risk of the mission if it meant sparing his friend from a terrible fate. The Soyuz 1 was launched on the 23rd of April, 1967. When it carried Kamarov into space, that made him the first Soviet cosmonaut to fly in space twice. But as soon as he got to space, that's when the problems began, and just didn't stop. Just a cascade of technical issues. Technical issue after technical issue, because the thing hadn't been prepared well. The first thing that happened was one of the solar panels failed to unfold, which led to a shortage of power for the spacecraft systems. Further problems with the orientation detectors complicated maneuvering the craft at all, and by orbit 13, the automatic stabilization system was completely dead, and the manual system was only partially effective, putting Kamarov in a really rough position. A second Soyuz flight was actually planned for the next day in order to conduct an EVA over Soyuz 1. The crew of that mission, Soyuz 2, modified their goals, preparing themselves for a launch that would include fixing the solar panel of Soyuz 1 in order to give Kamarov some much-needed power. But that night, fate had a much different idea. Thunderstorms over the launch pad in Kazakhstan affected the booster's electrical system, causing the whole mission to be called off, meaning Kamarov was completely on his own. During the 13th orbit, Kamarov reported further problems because, and the flight director decided it was best to abort the mission entirely. But Kamarov had a tall order in order to reorient the craft in order for a safe re-entry. He had to do this all manually, pushing everything he'd learned about flight in general to its absolute limit. After 18 orbits, Soyuz 1 fired its retro rockets and re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. Believe it or not though, despite all this trouble, Kamarov might still have landed safely. That would of course be assuming that the parachute had worked. To slow the descent, the first drogue parachute was deployed, which was followed by the main parachute. But the main parachute didn't unfold. The exact reason for that malfunction is still disputed, and when Kamarov activated the manually deployed reserve chute, it became tangled with the drogue chute. As a result of this, the Soyuz descent module fell to Earth almost entirely unimpeded, effectively hitting its terminal velocity at 89 miles per hour, 140 kilometers per hour. When rescuers got to the module, it was laying on its side with the parachute spread across the ground on fire. The retro rockets then started firing, which concerned rescuers as they were supposed to activate a few moments prior to touchdown, though it was likely that they were actually timed correctly based off of the fact that the parachute should have worked. The parachute didn't. By the time it landed and got close, the descent module was on fire itself, with black smoke filling the air. The entire base of the capsule actually burned through, and by that point it was pretty obvious to the rescuers that Kamarov had not survived, but there wasn't even a code signal for a cosmonaut's death, so they just fired a signal flare calling for medical assistance. Kamarov was named a hero of the Soviet Union for a second time, and awarded the Order of Lenin. He was given a state funeral, and his ashes were interred in the Kremlin Wall necropolis at Red Square, Moscow. 8 years after his death, a story was circulating that he cursed the engineers and flight staff and spoke to his wife as he descended. It's not believed that this was the case. There's actually generally a communications blackout upon this sort of re-entry, so it doesn't seem to make sense that this would have even been possible. Though, if it was, yeah, I could believe that. I would have been swearing a lot too, I'm not gonna lie. This whole launch was ridiculous. It never should have been undertaken in the first place until all the problems were worked out, and now a man is dead. The only good to come out of it is that the entire thing delayed the launch of Soyuz 2 and 3 until the 25th of October 1968. The whole debacle, actually, combined with the N-1 rocket also being a complete piece of garbage, helped convince Soviet higher-ups to cancel their moon plans. Many of the improvements that went into the capsules after the initial version were actually very similar to the improvements made to the Apollo 1 capsule. The Soyuz craft in general actually went on to be one of the longest-lived and most dependable crewed spacecraft yet designed. But that initial version, look, we can't ignore that, okay? I can't do that. I cannot ignore that. It's not allowed. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Somedude267, Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Benjamin Owens, Pension Kitson 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Josh Johnson, Little for Life, Guy Hanzak, A1, Arthur Roy, DM Trouble Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Alaric Jaspers, Brian, Jack Carson's Rara Videos, Major Klutz, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Dr. Racer 78, Crystal Morgan, Ohio Trucker 1, and Amtrak 2023 Productions. Till next time, this is Darkness, individual Lafon, farewell.